Hello? Hello? Nanoseconds, nanoseconds. Very good. We have, hi Munir. We have a wonderful set of people. I don't want to take any time right now in terms of introductory remarks. I'll fuse them because our first guest, Stephen Koltai, has to leave at 4:15, and then we're transitioning to Kurt Rhodes and Quesco. But I want to take full advantage of the time that we have. And so, Stephen, we usually ask our guests to do what we did this afternoon for a little bit of intellectual biography. Do you want to sit here?
Whatever you want.
Wherever you can feel most comfortable. Wherever you are. Zell, will this pick up the camera aimed at this or at that?
Wait a second. I'll check what it will take. Or maybe it might makes it easier for people to hear.
Is it mic'd up there, Zell? Guys, can you hear?
No, the audio's over there.
Is it easier if I have a mic?
It's fine.
Can you hear, Sam?
I can hear back here.
You can hear, Sam? Good. Perfect. So be it. Stephen Koltai is a friend. Remarkable accomplishments through, I think he bleeds blue and brown, or brown and blue. I'm not certain what the flow will be, but Stephen, who are you and why are you here?
Well, why am I here, I think that's the part you will have to address. But I am a double jumbo, or actually probably a triple jumbo, since my son just graduated last year. I went to Tufts and Fletcher. I was telling Sherman I was a TA in the first year of the first semester of the IR as an undergraduate major, which did not exist when I was a student here. So I have been very involved with Tufts for a very long time, and have been on about every committee and board you can be on here, and continue to be very committed and very involved with Tufts for the main reason that I think that the students are amazing and have been that way for a long time. And so I am very honored to be able to meet with some of you, because I know the kinds of students that you in particular are, who are attracted to this program, and so it's a very shorthand way of meeting a unique group of people. I will just very briefly give a little bit of background, but you probably know whatever you need to know. But
They do their reading.
You do your reading, and I suggested a few things to read. But just to recap, after Tufts and Fletcher, I had a Fulbright scholarship and went to Brussels, worked into what was then the Common Market, now the EU. And then I spent about 5 years on Wall Street in international corporate finance. I then have done several entrepreneurial ventures, of which the most successful was the first one I did, which was in '83, where I was the co-founder of a company that today is called SES, which is the largest commercial television satellite system in the world, based in Luxembourg, 52 satellites, 6,100 channels of audio, video, and data, everything from Al Jazeera to CNN to Sky Television, which I co-founded in 1983, and then spent a year as a fellow at a place called the Council on Foreign Relations, which was relevant because later on it's what sort of got me back to the State Department, which I'll talk about, and then went to McKinsey, and then spent the longest sort of straight period of my career working in the entertainment business in Los Angeles, which is my hometown. was at Warner Brothers for almost a decade, ending as the head of the operating committee at Warner Brothers. Left and started my own next startup, which was a e-commerce business in Los Angeles, which I sold in 2002, and then retired, and retired from sort of straight jobs. And since then, I've spent a lot of time in the entrepreneurship development space. And in 2009, I had moved from LA to Maine permanently, and I live in the mid-coast of Maine in Camden, Maine. And I had been interested in this whole issue of entrepreneurship in the service of foreign policy, as I put it, for a long time. And President Obama gave his famous speech at Cairo University in June of 2009, where he talked about using entrepreneurship in changing the relationship between the United States and Muslim communities, was the politically correct way of putting it. And basically what it was about was a recognition that the confrontational approach which the United States always had was not working, and was certainly not the only option, and there needed to be other ways to try to build relationships with Muslim countries. And so he talked about using America's traditional strength as an entrepreneurial society, and recognized that entrepreneurship is one of the things that people, that common people, not governments, most respect about the United States and about our culture. And people, even people who hate us the most around the world, of which by then there were quite a few, still respect that sort of entrepreneurial know-how. And that's something I have believed for a long time. I wrote about it when I was at the Council on Foreign Relations as a fellow in the mid-'80s, and I was very excited for the first time to hear a president of the United States use the word entrepreneurship and foreign policy in the same sentence. And so I had previously been given a fellowship at the State Department because I had been good friends and office mates with Condoleezza Rice, who was the Secretary of State right before Secretary Clinton, and it was good for 5 years. I hadn't taken it up during the Bush administration, but I now decided to do that, and I went to the State Department and worked on creating a program around entrepreneurship development, which became the Global Entrepreneurship Program, or GEP. And at the time, it was focused on Egypt, Indonesia, and Turkey, and with smaller programs in Lebanon, Jordan, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. And it was a good program, and it sort of addressed what President Obama had said in his speech he was promising to address, but it wasn't terribly high profile. And then came Mohammed Bouazizi and Tahrir Square, and then all of a sudden it became very high profile. And so I ended up being fortunate enough to spend quite a lot of time with Secretary Clinton, traveled with her quite a lot to the region, and created this program which was about very specific programmatic things that both the U.S. government, but also partners that the U.S. government would convene, could do to spur entrepreneurship in the countries that I mentioned. And I was very excited about it, worked very hard on it. It ended up being quite a frustrating experience because we had a lot of moral support, but very little material support, so virtually no dollars, no people, but lots of speeches. And so I'm an entrepreneur and a business guy, and this was all kind of surprising to me and upsetting, and so I quit. And I left, and I started my own consulting firm, which I still run, called Koltai and Company, and we do entrepreneurship ecosystem development in emerging markets. the same thing that I was doing at the State Department, all based on a particular model for entrepreneurship development that I came up with, which I call the 6+6 model, which I hope you have seen. There's a diagram of it on our website. And it's very simple. It basically presumes that in order to move the needle in promoting entrepreneurship and bolstering the ecosystem in a country, you can't do one thing. You have to look at it holistically. You have to look at it systemically. And the 6 pillars, or there are 2 categories of activity, 6 pillars of programs and 6 categories of actors that have to be knitted together. And the 6 categories of activities are identify, train, connect and sustain, fund, enable public policy, and celebrate entrepreneurs. Those are the points of the diagram on the site. And then the 6 categories of actors are corporations, foundations, universities, NGOs, investors, and government. And we've developed a program where you knit together programs with these 6 categories of partners that actually move the needle and affect change. And I, in addition to working on this consulting business, also started working on a book which I'm writing based at the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank in Washington, and it's called World Peace Through Entrepreneurship. And both of these together are really at the center of what I do these days, in addition to being on several committees at Tufts, like ELS and TISH and the T10 Strategic Planning Committee, where I'm on the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Task Force. So, what I wanted to really talk about was a little bit about the substance of some of the programs that I've done, and then I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at some of the materials that I signed, or not signed but suggested, and if there are thoughts or questions that you want to talk about with respect to any of those, either the articles that I suggested. I've written a couple of blogs for Brookings, one on Egypt just now, or any of the books that I suggested. I just brought 2 of them with me, Fixing Failed States and Boulevard of Broken Dreams, both of which are central to the book I'm writing, which is a very prescriptive set of recommendations for how the U.S. government should change the way it funds international economic development, and specifically to shift at least a little bit of the dollars to entrepreneurship development, which I consider to be the single most important way to create jobs. And I see a straight line connection between jobs, political stability, and civil society. So entrepreneurship is, to me, essential to creating an economic system that is characterized by hope and opportunity rather than by despair and frustration. So in the course of the work that I do, as I mentioned, we do programs. So it's not about policy, it's not about analysis, it's programmatic. We now, by the way, work in addition to the countries I mentioned, in non-Muslim countries. So right now we're working on a really interesting project in Ghana for the UK government. And what we do is programs that fall into one or more of those 6+6 categories. So just to give you some examples, Identify is the first category. So an example of an Identify program is a business plan competition, right? Identify entrepreneurs. But, there are lots of different kinds of business plan competitions. We work, I believe, very strongly, since I'm focused on job creation, in what I call no-tech, low-tech, and high-tech entrepreneurship. So in most of these places, Ghana being the most immediate example, because I was just there last week, 65% of the population is engaged in agriculture. If all you did was work in tech entrepreneurship, you'd be affecting, 2% of the country. So you really need to have a broader approach, and there are certainly tech entrepreneurship things that we support and that we are trying to help boost in the form of the recommendations we're going to make to the UK government. But there are also many things in the low-tech and no-tech category. So when you look at the category of programs around identifying entrepreneurs, business plan competitions, generally speaking, I like to do tech and non-tech, 2 separate tracks, early stage and growth stage, 2 separate kinds of companies. And there are partners that we work with. There are about 150 partners that we work with in various of the programs we work on. So when you talk about these business plan competitions, there are different organizations, mostly American but not exclusively, who have strengths in actually running these programs, which I've done in about a dozen countries now. We also have what I call a tentpole program that's been very successful, which are entrepreneurship delegations. I've done 8 of these, 7 of them as State Department official delegations. They consist of 12 to 15 American early stage investors, both angel investors and venture capitalists, and what I call rock star entrepreneurs. We go to a country, we've done the 8 countries I mentioned, Egypt, Indonesia, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. We're about to do one to Ghana, and hopefully next year we'll be doing one to Peru. These are activities that have several sub-activities around them. So they're centered on a business plan competition, but they also include a bunch of other things. We have several speed mentoring events to help people with their develop their ideas. We have a thing that I've developed that's really interesting. It's called an Insiders Roundtable, which is a conversation with local potential angel investors and our actual angel investors to try to bolster the angel investment climate, which is one of the key programs that I try to build under the fund category of the 6+6 model. There are a whole host of other activities that touch on various of those 6+6 categories. The last example that I'll mention before just opening it up to conversation is in the celebrate category. You know, coming from the entertainment and media business, I think that celebrating and storytelling is extremely important. And in almost every country that I work in, when you look at sort of polls of what are the biggest problems confronting the development of what are the biggest issues impeding the development of entrepreneurship in your country, even before access to capital, which is usually number 2, number 1 is culture. And in most developing countries, and also frankly, not just developing countries, but also the OECD, like Japan, there's a very strong anti-entrepreneurial cultural force. Particularly for the best and the brightest. So unlike here, where if you go to a place like Tufts, it would be cool for you to start your own company, and I hope some of you are, and it would be cool for you to take, you know, courses in our ELS program, which I hope some of you are, and it would be cool for you to work for a startup when you finish school, which I hope some of you will do, rather than going to Wall Street or working at McKinsey, both of which I did. But in developing countries, that's almost never the case. So if you know, starting your own business is a very low class, low prestige thing to do, and we try to change that. And one of the ways we do that is through some Celebrate programs. So to give you some specific examples of things that we've done, we had quite a successful joint program with Coca-Cola in Indonesia, where we identified 5 young entrepreneurs in a competition which Coke ran, who were then featured on Coke cans, whose story was told on billboards and bus signs, and for whom there was a PSA, public service announcement, done profiling each one of these 5 people, talking about what they had done, and the approach that I suggested to Coke was, you know, you're interested in connecting with young, happening, bubbly people who are your future market. That's who these entrepreneurs happen to be, and they're much more relatable to, you know, the average person in Bandung than is Mark Zuckerberg. So rather than talking always about the same cast of characters, the same sort of American celebrity entrepreneurs, wouldn't it be cool if we talked about some Indonesian entrepreneurs that probably none of you have ever heard of, but who are actually doing quite extraordinary things? And we were able to change the conversation a little bit because people could relate to these people, and they were local. So there are about 24 different programs that we run. In each country, we put together a plan. I call ourselves architects and general contractors of entrepreneurship ecosystem development projects. We work, as I said, with about 150 subcontractors, so we're the architect and the general contractor, who comes up with the building design, but then there's somebody who does the foundation, there's somebody who does framing, there's somebody who does windows, there's somebody who does tile, and we bid those pieces out and then manage the whole process in what we hope is a coherent and holistic way. In Egypt and Indonesia and Turkey, the countries I've been working in the longest, and each of them I've probably made about 15 trips to in the last 3 years. We've been fairly successful, including in Egypt, with having taken one of our first entrepreneurship delegations to, which happened to include Chris Schroeder, who I think is going to come and speak to you. It was his first time in the Arab world and led to a whole awakening in his new book that just came out, Startup Rising, which came out of his participation in the delegation that we did to Egypt, which ended 5 days before Tahrir Square. So that's kind of, in broad terms, the background of who I am and the kind of work we do. And really, I'm very interested in, hearing both questions and comments. They don't have to be questions. If there were things that you read that you wanted to talk more about, or things that I've said now that you want to talk more about, I'd love to do that.
Jenna.
Hi, I'm Jenna. So in countries where you haven't had any contact with, or in countries that you're looking to start working in, how do you go about initiating this process of promoting entrepreneurship? Where do you start?
So there's a 3-step process, which is diagrammed on the website, that we go through. It's diagnostic, design, and implementation. And right now we're just finishing the diagnostic phase in Ghana, which is about 4 months, which is a mapping and diagnostic phase. Who's doing what programs are there. Then we move to a design phase, which varies in length of time, but usually it's less than 3 months. And then most of what we do is implementation, and which can be over multi-years. This particular program in Ghana will be a 4-year program. That's what the funder wants to do. Our clients can be governments, they can be foundations, corporations, or increasingly investors. And I do a fair bit of work now with family offices who are impact investors, if any of you are familiar with that concept of impact investing, which is a huge and rapidly growing source of funding for a lot of this kind of stuff. So it's that 3-step process: diagnostic, design, implementation.
And in Ghana, it's potentially happening with one of your predecessors, Rachel Kirkendall. David.
Hi, my name's David. So in one of your articles that you wrote called Yellow Piece Through Entrepreneurship, you talked about the divide between how we do things in America and how the state government operates. So I was wondering if you could talk, I know you have a business background, and I'm sure you're working with a lot of people through the government on this, through your fellowship. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about at what points, I guess, your ideas sort of conflicted with how the government operate, or if you could maybe tell some stories of when there were those sort of differences and when they arose.
One of the chapters in my book is called Through the Looking Glass, and it is about the observations of somebody who had a business background and came to work in Washington. It took about 20 seconds for me to realize that this was a different planet. They spoke English. They looked like they were American. They had, American TV shows. There was a Starbucks everywhere, but it was really a parallel universe. And so I was an entrepreneur and a business guy. And and there are some basic principles which I have always lived with and none of which apply, at least not at the State Department. So for example, when you're a startup, especially if you're an investor, which I occasionally am in startups, what you want to do as the founder is you want to under-promise and over-deliver. You want your investor to be really happy that you've actually done better than you promised. At the State Department, it's the opposite. The pattern is that we overpromise and underdeliver because we assume nobody ever will check. So, for example, in the Cairo speech and in the aftermath of the Cairo speech, the U.S. government pledged literally billions of dollars to MENA for various projects. One of them, I was there on the podium in Tunisia when Secretary Clinton pledged $80 million for entrepreneurship development training, workforce development training, which was about 3 years ago. It was her first trip to Tunisia after the uprising. Not a penny of that has ever been dispersed to date. EPIIC pledged $2 billion in a technology and innovation fund for MENA. There were 7 fund managers selected. Not a single penny has ever been invested to date. My program, which was generally thought of as, certainly if you read the speeches, as one of the most successful programs that the State Department was sort of spearheading with respect to civil society developments of non-military. We were one of the few things that were focused on particularly job creation for young people in MENA, which most people thought was kind of the point of the revolutions. We never received any direct funding at all, not a single penny from the State Department. Although we did bring in money from other U.S. government agencies like USAID. So the disparity between what was claimed and what was done was extraordinary, and it was particularly galling to me because in the private sector, even if you do something experimental and you're an entrepreneur and you try something new, if it works, eventually you get supported. So even the naysayers will eventually say, okay, Affordable Care Act, terrible idea, going to destroy America, but like Medicare, where Johnson had to call out the troops to enforce the rollout of Medicare in several states, once it's been around for a while, people can't imagine life without it and support it. So I thought that since the Arab Spring was happening, since all of this was going on, since the problems were getting worse, not better, since we did in fact start an incubator in Cairo called Flat 6 Labs, which has now had 2 cohorts of 16 companies each who've been successfully incubated, 3 of which have established offices in the United States, and almost all of which have secured at least Series A funding, which is pretty significant considering there's a revolution going on. I thought that would be like the good news, and so they would want to support that, and the answer is no, there was not a penny invested. So that was another example of a clash between my perception as a business person and the way the government worked.
Did they explain at all the rationale of not financially supporting it?
Well, no, and that is a very important question, and it's the main thing my book is about.
The new book.
The new book that I haven't written yet, which is an unbelievable pain in the neck, and which I'm really trying hard to write.
Need any help pushing out the door?
I need a lot of help. But
Anybody want to help you?
Here's the thing. The thing is that, and this is really important, it is very easy to be glib and cynical about the government. And the fact of the matter is that there are some incredibly smart, incredibly devoted people who are working there and frustrated and imprisoned by exactly the same thing that I saw. There are really good reasons why it's not working. They mostly have to do with the way procurement and contracting is structured in the U.S. government. It is not capricious. It is not because nobody knows that this isn't how it should be happening. They are really good reasons. It's sort of like the current budget impasse. For people to say that, you know, Boehner and the Republicans are just trying to, you know, drive America into the toilet is absurd. That couldn't be further from the truth. That is a simplistic way of looking at it. These are all elected representatives who represent a certain constituency, which in most cases, if you look at the most hardline Tea Party people, is 80% behind what they're doing. So from their perspective, from the perspective of their constituents who they were sent to Washington to represent, they are doing their job. And the same is true in the problem that I had. You know, the people who were not funding the program had very good and real reasons for not doing so. Not because they didn't like the program, but because all of the competing priorities, because all of the rules of procurement and contracting prohibited them from turning around on what they perceived to be the dime and funding a program, because procurement cycles are 5-year cycles. And most of this money is pre-committed, just like most of the US budget is pre-committed. So the events that were happening in Egypt, as far as they were concerned, if they were still a problem 5 years from now, then you should apply for a grant. But 5 years ago, when we gave you the grant, that wasn't what it was about. 5 years ago, what it was about was decentralizing industry away from Cairo. So the one grant that I got for my program originally was, yes, you can start an entrepreneurship program, but it has to be in Port Said. Because we have money to decentralize things away. And I said, well, that would be really good, except there are no entrepreneurs in Port Said. So it would be a little bit awkward. And by the way, since the last procurement was announced, I don't know if you noticed, USAID mission chief in Cairo, but there was a revolution. And so it's actually quite different now than it was when the terms of reference were first spelled out for the first award cycle. And that's very, very difficult for the US government to get its head around.
You're a guest. Who are you, sir?
Connor, I got a question about your program where you bring VCs and angels from the U.S. to these foreign countries. I'm curious why you don't try to collaborate with the existing venture philanthropy or angel investors in the countries.
That's a really easy question. None of the places that I go to have any angel investors. And what I'm about is trying to start those. Now, in some places, so for example, in Ghana, there's something called the GAIN, the Ghana Angel Investors Network, which has quite a lot of people, at least as many as are in this room, and they have been around for about 4 years. They have never done a single solitary transaction of any kind, not one.
What about Indonesia? Grassroots Business Fund, LGTBT?
Well, Grassroots Business Fund is not an angel fund, it's a private equity fund. It's based in Washington, and it has done one transaction in Indonesia. And there is no functioning, I mean, we have tried to start an Indonesian angel group. Indonesia happens to be one of the places that I've worked the longest. So I know the angel scene there particularly well, and there has yet to be a single deal done. Now, having said that, you know, in my view, bringing American investors is only helpful if there are local interested people who are also interested in participating. So this is a catalytic kind of program, not a, you know, people from the US are going to invest in Indonesia. No, because that's, you know, I mean, I'm very excited when we get $300,000 or $400,000 worth of seed investments in a country after a delegation, which is kind of what we average out of these delegations. But the big thing is getting local investors to join with the US investors to invest in emerging companies in their own country for the first time. That, to me, is the home run.
Let's stay on the MENA region, please. Sam.
Oh, my name is Sam. Unless you just
Clearly.
Howdy.
Yes. So there are a number of books that have been written about why the Middle East region didn't develop large businesses in the same way as Western Europe did, most of which focus on issues with setting up corporations. The corporation law and contract law in the Middle East, way back in the 11th century, didn't develop in the same way as Western Europe. And so culturally that created this sense that you don't have large businesses, you don't put a lot of people together to do work in business senses. And I wonder if you've ever run into anything like that, if that historical precedent still plays a role in the region. in your experience?
Well, I mean, this is a big subject, obviously, and lots of people from Bernard Lewis on down have written very thoughtful things about it, which I couldn't possibly claim to summarize. But, you know, one of the slides I use in the presentation I give, which is actually online, it's a TED talk I gave, is, you know, I show a picture of what we all think of as our cool entrepreneurs. And so I've got, you know, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Martha Stewart. And then, so I said, so this is what we all think of when we think of, you know, cool entrepreneurs. And then I said, here's my picture of cool entrepreneurs. And it's a picture of a playground in the South Bronx where the concrete is all broken and there's syringes and condoms and broken glass, and there are a few pieces of crabgrass growing up between the cracks in the broken concrete. That is what my world of entrepreneurship looks like. My world of entrepreneurship in emerging markets, and particularly in MENA, looks like that. It looks like incredible adversity. It looks like corruption that you can't imagine. It looks like a total lack in most places, not everywhere, but in most places, of any sort of organized support for entrepreneurs. And what I found is that notwithstanding, if you really look, and any of you who have worked in developing countries, which in a group like this is probably quite a lot of you, will know that there are people who have done incredible things with very, very little. And the theory of the kind of work I do is, and then the next picture I show is a beautiful sculptured flower garden. And the argument I make is that if you take the crabgrass growing up through the cracked concrete, and you lift up some of the concrete and you water it and you fertilize it and you prune it, you can have a garden. The raw materials are there. And I believe that that is true everywhere that I have worked, including in MENA, notwithstanding the various apologists who have historical sort of reasons why this didn't happen. And I have to say, you know, most of the world, I mean, sub-Saharan Africa, you know, none of these institutions existed there either. So, you know, I don't think that MENA is necessarily worse off. MENA does have, generally speaking, the highest youth unemployment rate in the world, and I think there are some reasons for that. But I don't think that the entrepreneurial environment, the ecosystem, when I do the diagnostic work, I don't think it's necessarily that much worse than other bad places I work.
Ooh, you were there with us this afternoon. Someone who wasn't Roland?
Hi, I'm Roland. You mentioned Turkey, and I was wondering what the sort of work you do in Turkey and how that's a little bit different with a sort of stronger economy than someplace like Egypt.
That's a really good question. Turkey is probably now the country I've worked in the longest because I'm still there. Turkey is, you know, not one country. So the first thing that needs to be said is there's Istanbul and then there's Turkey. And so if your experience of Turkey is Istanbul, that would be the same as going to the United States and never leaving Manhattan. So for any of you who are not from Manhattan, or have ever been any place other than Manhattan, you will know that the United States does not all look like Manhattan. So Istanbul is a separate conversation. Turkey, which has 85 million people, of whom 70 million do not live in Istanbul, and actually probably now it has more than that because it has a lot of Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees, has a widely disparate ecosystem in terms of levels of development. There are a few major university towns, Gaziantep, for example, which have surprisingly resilient raw materials from which to build an ecosystem. Universities, as I'm sure none of you will be surprised to know, tend to be one of the key things you first look for as a green shoot of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. Not the only thing, but one of the first things. So there are other parts of Turkey that have those, have some of those, but we do a lot of work in places outside of Istanbul. Having said that, one of the theories I have is that you have to have a critical mass. So you have to have a locomotive that pulls the train. And that locomotive very much is Istanbul. And you do have to bring people there, and you do have to bolster that ecosystem, and you do have to build angel investor groups there, and you do have to have exits of real companies that are acquired that can show that, yes, you can actually make money doing this, which we, thank God, have had now in Turkey, several great exits. But the whole country does not look like Istanbul.
Questions? Patrick?
In terms of entrepreneurs, once they've established perhaps a burgeoning business, do you ever worry about them running into some really entrenched systemic problems and not being able to overcome those, other things besides corruption, such as infrastructure in a lot of these countries, and a lot of effort going into establishing this, but with nowhere to expand?
Yeah, that is absolutely, so yes, that's very much the case. And what I say when people ask me, what is the single most important thing an entrepreneur needs to succeed? And this is true whether you are in Maine, where I'm involved in entrepreneurship development, or in Ghana. It's not money, it's not electricity, it's not security, it's mentorship. And that is the single most important thing. So we spend a lot of time and energy building mentor networks. And generally speaking, the best mentors are from that economy. So they are people who have had to deal with exactly that problem before. You're not explaining something to anyone. They will know what you're talking about. What I have found is there are always people. Sometimes you have to look for it very, very hard. Sometimes it's really difficult. Probably the single most corrupt country I've ever worked in is Indonesia. But there are people who've been successful entrepreneurs there. And if you find those, and those are the ones who, number one, you persuade to become mentors, which takes a little selling. And then number two, you put them, you're a good matchmaker, and you connect them with the right entrepreneur that really resonates to their particular story. Then you end up having what is usually a much more productive, helpful relationship for the entrepreneur. So, do I wish that the enabling environment everywhere was, far more favorable than it is? Absolutely. Do I think that there are some key issues like availability of electricity and certainly security that need to be in place before you can do some of the kinds of work that we do? Yes. But I believe that entrepreneurs exist in every, broken playground and can be helped.
When?
That actually was my question as well, but I don't know that question. So my name is Wen, evidently, and I was wondering, do you find that the people who grew to be entrepreneurs tend to come from a certain socio-economic class, a certain sort of cultural background within the country? And do they tend to be more sort of westernized with Western education, perhaps richer and therefore more access to resources?
Yeah, I love that question because it's so counterintuitive, my actual experience. So I always tell this story. I know a lot of entrepreneurs in a lot of developing countries. I don't have one favorite, but there's one story, one entrepreneur in particular that I'm especially fond of because he was in Egypt, and Egypt is kind of special for me because it was my first child doing this kind of work. And that is two brothers, Ashram and Haitham El-Fadil, who are actually in Chris's book as well. They started a company called Kengin, K-N-G-I-N-E. It now is also has a branch in Palo Alto. These are two brothers who, when I first met them 4 years ago, they were 21 and 23. They're from Alexandria. They are middle class by Egyptian standards. One of them went to kind of a technical school. One of them did not. but they are brilliant. And they have started a company that has an extraordinary product, which is a voice-activated complex search function that you can use on your cell phone. So you can say, what's the best Italian restaurant in Cambridge that has availability for 2 people tonight at 7:30 and that is medium priced? And I can ask that question on my phone in 4 languages and it will give me an answer. So they came up with the algorithm for that. So on the trip I took to Egypt, the one that Chris was on, one of the other delegates was Mike Cassidy, who's the head of search at Google at the time, not anymore. And he, on the spot, invested $50,000 in these 2 guys. Now, there was nothing in their back. They did not go to AUC, American University in Cairo, which is the elite school. They did not, of which there are several American universities, Beirut being one of the great examples. They did not come from an aristocratic family. Neither of them had ever been outside of the United States. One of them spoke really bad English with a lisp, and the other spoke nothing, except Arabic. So they were not the people who you would have picked out of a lineup, but they were one of the most outstanding, startups that I have come across, and I've seen a lot of startups now. So I think that there's not necessarily one type. It's always the surprise, when you hear what's her name, who on The Voice or Idol, Susan Boyle. It's this wonderful thing when somebody like Susan Boyle, with all this attitude resonating around her, comes out and lets loose of this unbelievable thing, which causes the whole world to start crying. And that's how I kind of felt when I heard Haitham El-Fadil pitch his company.
Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah.
Yes, Cody.
Hi, sorry. Well, my name's Cody. My question is apropos those 2 entrepreneurs there. What I encountered in Kenya was a vibrant and growing tech and software community, homegrown Kenyans. And I was conflicted because on the one hand, they were totally going to inspire new generations of Kenyan entrepreneurs to go out, make businesses, create products, and have a great exit strategy, make some money. And that's entrepreneurship. And on the other hand, there's so many social issues that they can be directing their skills towards as more social entrepreneurs, as we've come to call them. And I'd just love your thought on that. If you feel that conflict sometimes, or because there's scarce resources in what we can all support, and whether you think it's good to direct burgeoning sectors towards social issues or let them flourish in the more commercial market.
That's
Did you hear the question in the back?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I'm sort of a free market capitalist. That's my own particular political bent, in case any of you didn't know. So I believe in letting the market decide. I don't believe that anybody can channel, particularly entrepreneurs who tend to be sort of type A personalities. What I think you can do, and that does have, to me, a lot of resonance, is you can mentor and you can provide support that encourages people who maybe are a little scared to do something that's a little different, to succeed. So that's the first thing I would say, is that I think you have to go with the flow of what people want to do and help them realize what they want to do. In any population, there will be some people who feel more strongly than others about something that has a double bottom line payoff versus that's purely profit oriented. The second thing I will say is, I've been on the Tisch board for 10 years, and one of the things we talk about a lot at Tisch is there, do you do active citizenship, public service at a certain time in your life, like after you've made a lot of money, and then you go off and do this? Or is it something that you do, all the time? And I sort of have this view of you do it all the time. I mean, there are times when you have more time than others. There are times when you have more resources than others. That certainly has been true in my life. When I was, building my company or working you know, at McKinsey or whatever, 100 hours a week living in a hotel room, you know, I didn't have a lot of time. It's also not a lifestyle I suggest to anybody, by the way. But I think that you have to do it at the same time. And one of the points of Tufts, and one of the points that we try to make at Tisch, and I think that you try to make in this program here, is that don't compartmentalize your life. Don't say that this is the time I'm working hard, making a lot of money, and that's all I'm going to do. And then all of a sudden I'm going to change to being a caring, warm, sensitive human being when I'm 45. Up until then I'm going to be an asshole. But now when I'm 45, I'm going to be a sensitive, warm, caring human being and help others. I think that's very difficult and probably doesn't work. So I think it's better to try to encourage people to do both things at the same time. And the last thing I'll say is I don't personally believe that there's such a thing as social entrepreneurship. So to me, there's entrepreneurship. If your business model is not sustainable, that is, if it does not have a way to generate income other than cup in hand, you do not have a business. And I don't care whether you are providing, you know, heating blankets for, you know, premature newborns in the jungle, or whether you are, you know, doing a new mobile app. Unless there is a market for whatever it is you are producing, with people who have some means of paying for that, or somebody else paying for it on their behalf, if it's a different business model, you don't have a business. So whether you're a social entrepreneur or a business entrepreneur, the basic disciplines of learning how to run a business and build a business are the same. And those are the things that I think are teachable.
Teachable moment. So I met you, Steve, in Turkey. You're putting Ashraf Ghani's book away. Ashraf is a former Jean Mayer Award winner here. We're interested in fixing states and fixing individuals. And we were discussing ways this afternoon with Steve to get engaged in these sorts of concerns. Egypt is a place you can help us. And we're going to try to come back to you to figure out how to do that. All right?
Great.
Guys, we'll take a 5-minute break before we come on with Kurt and Mike and begin to look at questions.